We are back again with On the Money Line, a podcast by MMA Play 365. I'm your host Newsome, and we are back at the UFC Apex for UFC Vegas 25. UFC 261 last Saturday was just unbelievable. I thought I'd miss the empty arena and being able to hear every strike and all the corner work, but honestly the crowd is truly a game changer, and the sooner we get back to packed out arenas every week the better. UFC 261 will also go down in history as one of the best UFC events of all time. It was outstanding. But back to this card. This weekend we have an amazing main event in the light heavyweight division and a fight that will have championship fight implications too, as Dominick Reyes will throw down with Jiri Prochazka. I'm really looking forward to that fight. But just before we get into that fight and into the breakdowns, as always, there's a few things to mention in regards to MMA Play 365, recapping the last card, and also an announcement, a bit of news for you guys as well. The last event was a decent night across the board. We did drop on Jimmy Crute, which was just one of those low percentage outcomes, as one leg kick from Smith completely shut Crute's leg down, leading to the doctor calling off the fight. And like I said, it was just unfortunate, as I firmly believe that Crute was on his way to winning that fight. However, we cashed easily on back Gabriel and had some great closing line value there, and also set up a nice parlay with Kamaru Usman and another fighter on this event too. Our money back guarantee dog of the week was Uriah Hall, who won early due to the devastating leg break of Chris Weidman. My thoughts go out to Weidman and his family, and I wish him a speedy recovery there. And finally, a quick announcement: Daily Fantasy Sports DFS is back at MMA Play 365 from May the 2nd, as we are reopening that platform to help anybody who plays DraftKings and FanDuel. We have brought in a new DFS expert in DFS Sniper. A lot of people will know this guy from the MMA community on Twitter, so if you play DraftKings or FanDuel, make sure you grab your subscription next week. Remember, we have multiple packages on the MMA Play 365 website for all the betting advice and DraftKings and FanDuel advice you'll ever need. We also have various subscription lengths and options too, so to see our full service list, please go and visit MMAplay365.com for more information or to sign up today. And let's break down some fights in the main event in the light heavyweight division. We've got Dominick Reyes versus Jiri Prochazka. Prochazka's currently the minus 130 favourite. The comeback on Reyes at plus 110 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, honestly I think the line is quite accurate, and it's probably where I expected it to be as well. I do understand to an extent people's comments on Reyes shouldn't be the underdog and the value's all on Reyes at plus money, and like I say, I do kind of get that, but on the flip side to that, if this line was flipped and it was Prochazka at plus money, then it just wouldn't last very long, and also you'd see probably double the amount of bettors on Prochazka at plus money than what we've seen on Reyes at plus money as well. So from that perspective, you have to understand that the line is accurate for that reason. If the books had opened Prochazka as the underdog, it would have flipped instantly. And as for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I do think there's going to be some fluctuation. Jiri Prochazka went up to minus 150 a couple of days ago. Now it's closed up a little bit, and I do anticipate it keeping closing up as well. I do think every now and again we'll get a little bit of a surge of money coming in on Prochazka, but ultimately when they step into the cage on Saturday night, it could be very close to a minus 110 pick'em on either side. Now as for how this fight plays out, it's an amazing fight at the top of the division. Obviously, you've got Reyes, who's already fought for a UFC championship twice now against John Jones, where he was very close and, in my opinion, should have probably edged that fight and got the win on the scorecards. Then he went in against Jan Blachowicz for the vacant UFC light heavyweight championship fight, and unfortunately for Reyes, he got blasted out of the water there. And then as for Jiri Prochazka, he's only had one fight in the UFC, but he debuted in the UFC against Volkan Ozdemir and knocked him out, which is an impressive win, and ultimately that's why everybody is so high on Prochazka, because he was able to come into the UFC and put on the type of performances that we've seen from him outside of the UFC, and that's really important. Now as for how these two fighters match up against each other, first of all, I think that this fight is won and lost on the feet. Reyes can wrestle, he's probably the more likely fighter to wrestle as well. I'd be shocked to see any sort of takedown attempts from Prochazka. I just don't see it happening, but Prochazka's really difficult to take down, and if he is taken down, he can get back up to his feet as well. So yeah, I don't anticipate the ground game and the grappling, the jiu-jitsu playing much of a factor in this fight at all. So then you go into how these two match up on the feet, and with Dominick Reyes, fights out of a southpaw stance. He'll fire kicks to the inside leg of his opponent. He'll fire kicks to the open body of his opponent as well. Obviously, I'm talking about opponents that do stand in an orthodox stance. He really loves to attack that open body. And then with him attacking the legs and the body, he can also sneak a kick up to the head as well. So he really does use his distance well when he's given the opportunity to dictate the pace and dictate the range. And in regards to his punches, it all seems to be straight punches from Reyes. He's like a sniper, throwing punches down the middle, opposed to, winging big hooks at his opponents. It's all jabs and then the straight two down the pipe. And on the other side, we've got Jiri Prochazka. Now, Prochazka's a completely different striker. He's all about aggression, pressure, power, and he's got really unorthodox movement as well. You don't really know what angle he's going to take, and he's in and out of range in weird ways also. He's just a very difficult fighter to try and get a read on inside the cage, and that's where Prochazka's going to have advantages in this fight, because from Reyes' perspective, if he can't get his reads easily in this fight, if he can't get his timing down either on his strikes, it's going to be really difficult for Reyes to be technical, and that's what he is, a technical striker. So if you take that away from Reyes, then he suddenly doesn't become as efficient as what we're used to seeing from him. Now, something else that I've picked up in tape is, obviously Reyes looked phenomenal against Jon Jones. He didn't look that great against Blachowicz. I don't discredit Blachowicz there. I think Blachowicz actually put on a great performance himself, but there's a lot of question marks of how can you look like that against Jones, but you can't replicate that against Blachowicz. But the one thing that I've noticed is, if you look at the two fights that are close from Reyes' UFC career so far, and obviously one of them he lost, being Jan Blachowicz. The other fight that I'm talking about is Volkan Ozdemir. The two things that those fights have in common is that both fighters were aggressive against Reyes. They were able to touch him up, they were able to bust him up and just really start to work at him. Volkan busted the nose of Reyes halfway through that fight, and I do think that that played a part in Volkan being able to push on harder and be more aggressive and make that fight really close, a fight where a lot of people thought that Ozdemir actually won. And then Blachowicz obviously had Reyes badly hurt to the body with those kicks. He also broke Reyes' nose in that fight as well. So to me, there's a trend here. If you are an aggressive fighter that will push forwards, that will take a punch to land a couple of yourself, and you can really start busting Reyes up, then that gives you the best chance of winning that fight. And honestly, that is Jiri Prochazka's game. Prochazka is an aggressive pressure fighter that will be landing hard strikes, that if he does touch you, he is going to bust you up, he is going to cut you. There is a chance that he'll wobble you, rock you, or knock you out as well. So honestly, I do see a very similar style in Prochazka as what you see in Volkan Ozdemir and as what you see in Jan Blachowicz. And I think that is the style to really get at Dominick Reyes. So that's one reason why I am favouring Jiri Prochazka in this fight, just because we've seen Reyes struggle against these big, powerful pressure fighters, and Prochazka is exactly that. Now, the other thing you've got to take into consideration is this fight going to go the distance, or is it going to end inside the distance? I personally think it's going to end inside the distance. I would be quite surprised if we got 25 minutes in this fight, and because of that, I just feel that Prochazka is the more likely fighter to find the finish. Again, with his pressure, with his aggression, with his power strikes, I just feel that he's the more likely fighter to finish this fight, in a fight that I don't see going 25 minutes. I think he's got the style to beat Reyes. I definitely think Reyes is going to have his moments in this fight. Would I be shocked if Reyes beat Prochazka, if he was the one that knocked him out? No, I'm not saying that Reyes has no chance of finishing Prochazka. I'm just saying that I feel that Prochazka is the more likely fighter to finish the fight, and I've seen the style of Prochazka in other fighters give Reyes real problems inside the cage. So for those reasons, I'm picking Jiri Prochazka to win this fight. And in the next fight, in the co-main event, we've got Swanson versus Giga Chikazde. Giga Chikazde is currently the minus 185 favourite. The comeback on Swanson at plus 160 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I did think that Chikazde would be around a minus 200 favourite, which he was a couple of days ago. We have had some money coming in on Swanson. I do get it to an extent. He did look good in his last fight, but because Chikazde is now sitting at the minus 185 range, I thought it'd be around minus 200. I do think there's slight value on Giga Chikazde at the current money line. As for where the betting lines move throughout fight week, I do think there's going to be a little bit of fluctuation on either side. I don't think the lines are going to move too drastically though, if I'm being honest. Again, I see the current trend of Swanson, the money coming in on Swanson continuing. I do think he might get down to plus 150, but then I do see money coming back in on Giga if this line gets too close. So ultimately, when they step into the cage on Saturday night, I don't think the betting lines are going to be too far off from where they're sitting right about now. Now, as for how this fight plays out, Cub Swanson is a veteran of the game. I don't think that he's washed up. I still definitely think that he's got something to give in this fight. And you look at the previous fights he's had, like one of them I was watching Shane Burgos the other day, and Burgos is a fighter that a lot of people thought that should have ran straight through him, and Swanson held his own, he stayed in there. But then there's other fights like the Renato Moicano fight where Swanson didn't look as great. He got dropped with a jab and then he was finished. And it's just inconsistencies. I don't think he's washed. It's just inconsistent performances. In his last time out, Swanson did look decent. He had to weather a storm though. He ate some brutal low kicks, and honestly Daniel Pinheiro probably should have been finishing him in that spot, but he didn't. Swanson came back and he got the win, an impressive win, that's great. But when we look over at Giga Chikadze, this is a fighter that I've overlooked in previous fights and been wrong about. Chikadze's developing really well in MMA. We know he's a phenom when it comes to kickboxing, but he's really rounding out his game well with good defensive wrestling, good defensive Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and his striking is just leveling up inside the cage as well. And it's clear to see that he's learning a lot at King's MMA, especially working under Master Rafael Cordero. One aspect of Giga Chikadze's striking that's improving, in my opinion, is his boxing. Obviously, like I've already said, he's a kickboxer. That's where his background is, so his kicks were always going to be great. But his punching lacked a little bit, but it's coming on leaps and bounds. He's becoming really aggressive inside the cage now as well, and everything he throws just seems to be thrown crisp, clean, powerful. He doesn't waste too much energy. That's another thing as well. His cardio seems to be improving also. That fight against Omar Morales, the volume that he put out in that fight, and the fact that he was throwing power in most of those strikes, yet he didn't look too tired until the latter stages of round 3, which is absolutely normal, is proof that the cardio is improving as well. And he's got to be careful defensively in this fight, because Swanson's boxing is decent. Swanson will rip to the body and the head as well. That to me is one of Swanson's best assets right now in mixed martial arts. But I just don't see Cub Swanson being able to beat Giga Chikadze in a 15-minute kickboxing fight, unless Swanson mixes it up, because this is mixed martial arts, and tries to take Giga down. But I don't think Giga Chikadze is going to be able to get taken down easily if Swanson does get on top of him. I think that Chikadze will be able to make his way back up to his feet, and because of that, I don't think that there's going to be too big of an impact on the mat to affect the judges if it should go to the scorecards. I do think this fight is won and lost on the feet, whether it be by finish or whether it be going to the judges' scorecards, and that's where I just see Giga Chikadze being the far better fighter in this fight. I think that Chikadze is going to be too aggressive. I think he's going to be too powerful for Swanson in this spot. I think when he starts hitting Swanson, Swanson's going to start feeling everything. Giga, he'll kick to the legs, he'll kick to the body, he'll really start making Swanson think about where that next strike's coming from. And all in all, I just think it's going to be a really tough night for Swanson. It's just going to be difficult for him inside the cage. Like I've said, Giga Chikadze is leveling up fight to fight. I think this is a good opportunity for Chikadze to get a notable name on his winning record. I think Chikadze is the more likely fighter to finish this fight. I think Chikadze is the more likely fighter to win on the scorecards with volume, pressure and aggression. So for those reasons, I'm picking Giga Chikadze to win this fight. And in the next fight, this one's going to be explosive. We've got Iwan Cutelaba versus Dustin Jacoby. Cutelaba is currently the -130 favourite to come back on Jacoby at +110 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I think this one might surprise quite a few people, but I think the value is with the underdog in Jacoby at +110. I actually think that Jacoby should be a slight favourite in this fight for reasons that I will talk about soon, but yeah, for me, the +110 is the value side. And as for where the betting lines move throughout fight week, just a couple of days ago, this was a -110 pick'em on either side. The money's come back in on Cutelaba, and I do understand it. He's the guy that's been in the UFC what feels like forever now, but I do think at some point we will see another surge on Jacoby. And when both of these fighters step into the cage on Saturday night, I do think that we'll see another -110 pick'em. Now, as for how this fight plays out, like I said, I think it's going to be quite an explosive fight. I do think that Jacoby is definitely going to have advantages in this fight. The one thing that I will say is the disadvantage he has is from an experience perspective. The fact that Cutelaba's been in the cage in the UFC for years and fought some of the best fighters in the world definitely gives him an advantage in this fight, because Jacoby, this is a big step up for him. But I think from a technical perspective, this fight is probably going to be won and lost on the feet. I know we talk about this Greco-Roman wrestling background for Cutelaba, but we just never see it because the dude's a meathead. He comes in hot, he comes in looking to take his opponent's head off. He wants to put their chin into row Z. So that, for me, is really detrimental to the game of Cutelaba. Now, the thing is, he's got every chance of knocking every single opponent out that he fights, just because all it takes is one of those big aggressive punches or elbows of Cutelaba to land in the right place, and at light heavyweight, that's lights out and that's game over. But the thing is, he's not very technical when he's coming forward throwing these strikes. It's big winging bombs, and like I say, there's no real setup to any of the strikes that he's throwing. There's no real thought behind them. There's no real management of range dictating the pace of the fight. It's just rush forward and look to take your opponent out, and he is going to be a dangerous opponent for Jacoby, and Jacoby could definitely be knocked out in this fight. But I just think if Jacoby can weather a storm here, maybe tire Cutelaba out a little bit, or let Cutelaba tire himself out a little bit, get into the second round when things won't be quite as dangerous, get into the third round when things definitely won't be as dangerous as the first round, and that's when Jacoby will have every chance of winning this fight, because Jacoby is the more technical striker. He's got a kickboxing background. He's an experienced kickboxer, and sure, he's still a little green in mixed martial arts, but he's going to be the fighter that's putting thought behind his strikes, that's setting strikes up with other strikes, that's managing the range once obviously Cutelaba's tired, and being able to pick his shots. And that's where there's a big advantage in this fight. I think if he can get Cutelaba out of that first round in regards to surviving that round one, getting into round two, then I think Jacoby's going to start taking over the fight, the placement of his shots. I think he's going to be able to land on Cutelaba as well. And that's another issue for Cutelaba. I don't think he's defensively responsible. I don't think he moves his head too much. I don't think his movement is good enough to be able to evade the attacks of an experienced kickboxer. But still, with all this said, Dustin Jacoby has to be able to get out of that round one, because Cutelaba is going to come in fast, he's going to come in hot, he's going to be winging bombs, and all it takes is one of those punches to land. I'm siding with Dustin Jacoby in this fight, though. I think he's going to be able to weather a storm. Defensively, he's going to have to be on point, but again, like I said, he's got a kickboxing background, he's an experienced striker. That goes offensively and defensively. I think defensively, he can keep himself from getting knocked out in that first round, start to take over the fight late, either win a decision or knock Cutelaba out late as well. For those reasons, I'm picking Dustin Jacoby to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Strickland versus Krzysztof Jotko. Strickland is currently the minus 250 favourite to come back on Jotko at plus 210 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, again, I think the line's very accurate, it's very fair. If you are going to push me for a value side, I do think that minus 250 on Strickland is a better bet than the plus 210 of Jotko. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I do think we see more money coming in on Strickland the closer we get to fight night. I think at minus 250 there will still be people playing him straight, and I also think there will be people putting him in parlays as well. Even if he gets up to the minus 300 line, I still expect him to be in quite a few parlays. So I do think that the betting line gets wider, and I do think that Strickland closes closer to minus 300 come fight night on Saturday night. As for how this fight plays out, though, I think that both fighters have got a good all-round game. They can both strike, they can both wrestle, they can both grapple. I think, though, from Jotko's perspective, his best path to victory here is to try and take Strickland down, try and get that top control time in, because I think that Strickland is just a better striker at this point. He's got more volume, he's more technical, he's got nice fundamentals as well. So if Jotko does go toe-to-toe with Strickland, I don't think it's going to be a whitewash, but I do see Strickland being the better striker, and therefore he'd probably edge most of the minutes in the fight, therefore most of the rounds, and should probably win a comfortable decision. But for me, Jotko's got to get that wrestling going, which he can do. We've seen that earlier in his career, and also in his early UFC career. A lot of people were really high on Jotko, including myself. You know, him being a great prospect and potentially being a contender, but that's fizzled out a little bit. He hasn't really turned out the way a lot of us thought that he would. And in this fight, stylistically, I just don't think it's a good stylistic fight for him. I do think he will be able to get takedowns on Strickland. I just don't know how many he'll be able to get. He's not a relentless wrestler. He will shoot opportunistically, but I do think he's got to make it a primary focus in this fight. Otherwise, he's just going to get pieced up on the feet, in my opinion. And if Jotko does have a wrestling game plan and he does look to take Strickland down, Strickland isn't a slouch when it comes to wrestling. He's got good fundamentals, especially defensively. He can defend takedowns. He can make it hard for fighters to take him down. He can also be taken down as well, but it's just not easy is what I'm trying to get at. And in regards to controlling him on the mat, he's got a decent get-up game as well. He has underrated Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So I just question how relentless Jotko will be in the takedowns, and if he is relentless, how often can he take him down? Can he keep him down for long enough to really make an impact on this fight. I honestly don't see it happening. I think the fight is going to be won and lost on the feet, and that's where I think that Strickland is better in this fight. Jotko will have moments. I don't think it's going to be a whitewash, but again, when you're looking at fighters closing a round out and looking better within that round, I think that Strickland is going to edge every round in this fight, even though Jotko will have his moments. One fighter has to win each round, and I just see if this does go to a decision, that Strickland has edged every round, made it look comfortable and would win a decision. If there's a finish in this fight, I don't think either fighter hits with brute force power, but Strickland's accumulation in volume, we saw against Brendan Allen, he just gave Brendan Allen too much on the feet. He hit him too many times in the face, and eventually that crumbled Allen to the point where Allen, just couldn't take anymore, and that's the way Strickland would finish this fight if he was to finish it. So that's a possibility. I don't see the same coming back in from Jotko. Sure, 4-ounce gloves, one big hard punch landing clean on Strickland's chin could end the night. I do think that's probably Jotko's best chance of winning this fight. I think it's a low percentage outcome, and on the flip side, Strickland also has that one puncher's chance as well. So whichever way I look at this fight, I just think it's a favourable fight for Sean Strickland. I think he's the better fighter. I think the fight's won and lost on the feet, where Strickland will land more volume and the better quality of strikes as well. So for those reasons, I'm picking Sean Strickland to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got a great fight at bantamweight. We've got Merab Dvalishvili versus Cody Stamann. Dvalishvili is currently the -240 favourite. The comeback on Stamann at +200 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I do think that the line, again, I keep saying this on this fight card, I think it's quite accurate. I think the -240 is probably where I expected it as well. However, if you are going to push me for a value side here, I would still say that Dvalishvili is a better bet at -240 than what Stamann is at +200, and the main reason for that is just betting against Dvalishvili is just an absolute nightmare, because he's a nightmare of a fighter with his pace, his pressure, his wrestling, stuff that I'll get onto shortly. But yeah, having money against Dvalishvili is never fun. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I do think it's going to stay roughly around where it is. There might be a little bit of fluctuation. I do expect at +200 that we see some Cody Stamann money coming in. It might get to +180, +185, but again, if the line closes too much, if Merab Dvalishvili gets to -200 or -195, I do expect a surge of money on him coming back in. So all in all, when both fighters step into the cage on Saturday night, I do expect the betting lines to be sitting roughly where they're at right about now. Now, as for how this fight plays out, it's a really good fight. Both fighters are really solid wrestlers. They both like to push the wrestling in the fights. I do think that Stamann is the more well-rounded fighter. I think his boxing is definitely better than the striking of Dvalishvili. But with that being said, Dvalishvili's striking is improving from fight to fight, and you look at his last fight against John Dodson, he scored a couple of takedowns against Dodson, but his striking just looked significantly improved, and he was the better striker in that fight. And this is coming from John Dodson, who is a lifelong striker. He's quick, he's fast, he's powerful, he's got good movement, and he just couldn't get his game going against Dvalishvili, and that made Dvalishvili look the better striker. Again, you look at the striking of Dodson in general, I would say he's a better striker than Dvalishvili, but because of the way Dvalishvili fights, it really made Dodson hesitant to let his hands go, hesitant to really get volume out there on Dvalishvili, because he was just concerned of the pressure and the takedowns coming back at him. And this is what Dvalishvili does to his opponent. So even if you are the better striker, and in this case, as I've already mentioned, Stamann's the better boxer, you just got to question how much that'll factor into this fight, because Dvalishvili just won't stand inside that boxing range and just eat shots from Stamann. If he's inside that boxing range and he's getting pieced up, even if he's not getting pieced up, the one thing in his mind is close the distance, push him against the cage and take him down. Dvalishvili, as his nickname states, the machine. He is a machine. He's super physical. He can score 12, 13, 14 takedowns in a fight, not get tired, still be putting out the same work in round 3 as he does in round 1. He's a freak athlete, and I think that's going to be the difference in this fight. I do think that Stamann can be taken down. Stamann's been taken down in other fights. I'm not totally convinced that Dvalishvili can stay on top of Stamann, because Dvalishvili's top game is a little light and fighters can get up, but the thing is, if they get back up, they'll just get taken straight back down again, because that's what Dvalishvili does. So even though takedowns aren't scored as highly as what they used to be from a judge's scorecard perspective, if you're landing 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 takedowns in a fight, the judges then can't ignore that. And I just feel that the striking's going to be close, because I do think Stamann's going to be a little bit hesitant of overcommitting to anything in case he's taken down. And if Stamann does get too close, I think Merab will just close that distance a little bit more and tie up. I just feel that Stamann is in for a long night here. I don't think it's going to be completely all one-way traffic. Stamann will have moments throughout the rounds, but I just feel that Dvalishvili is a nightmare matchup, and Dvalishvili is actually a nightmare matchup for a lot of fighters in this division as well. I think he'd comfortably beat most of the fighters at the top of the division. I do think that he's on a similar sort of path and journey, again with the style as what Alexander Volkanovski did in the featherweight division. So I'm really high on Dvalishvili. I have been for quite a while. I do think on Saturday night he will be able to overcome the advantages that Stamann will have in the boxing department, just to make this fight his own, put the pace, put the pressure on him, score plenty of takedowns. So for those reasons, I'm picking Merab Dvalishvili to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Poliana Botelho versus Luana Carolina. Botelho is currently the minus 225 favourite to come back on Carolina at plus 185 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I think the line is about accurate, it's about fair. I know this has become a common trend in this episode of the podcast, but I do think that the betting line is roughly where it should be. As for a value side, I don't think there really is a value side here. I think that minus 225 at this level in women's MMA is risky, but the plus 185 on Carolina, I'm just not sold on Carolina to win the fight, even at plus 185. So yeah, I don't see value on either side, if I'm being honest. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I do expect the line to roughly stay where it is right about now. Botelho did get surged on in regards to money coming in on her. She was around minus 150, minus 155 a few days ago. Now she's sitting at minus 225, and that looks to be where the line settled. So come fight night on Saturday night, I think the betting lines are going to be roughly where they're sitting right about now. As for how this fight plays out though, like I said, I'm just not sold on Luana Carolina at all. I think at a certain level inside the UFC she can look good, you know, against a Priscilla Cachoeira type of fighter, but then she's coming off a loss against Ariane Lipski where she was knee barred within the first round very early on, so that's not a good look for her. And Botelho again is a decent fighter, but she's had her moments inside the cage where she hasn't looked that good. The thing is, the type of fighter that is the type of fighter that's causing Botelho problems is fighters that like to take her down and work the grappling. Botelho's definitely more of a striker, but you look at Gillian Robertson, you look at Cynthia Calvillo, both of those ladies had their way with Botelho. But then again, you can make the argument that you're really being a little unfair to Botelho there, because Gillian Robertson and Cynthia Calvillo are two really top fighters that are also absolutely levels above where Luana Carolina's at. So it's a little bit unfair to really discredit Botelho for those two losses, because Carolina would get smoked by those two as well. I think Carolina being more of a striker though is playing into where Botelho is good in this fight, and Luana Carolina, she likes to come forward, she likes to throw straight punches, but she's not the most technical of strikers. If it does get close into boxing range, she'll try and close that a little bit more. She loves to get that Muay Thai plum clinch going where she can fire knees and elbows, but again, it can be a little bit sloppy at times, and it doesn't look like it's the most solid of plum clinches either. So I don't think that she's going to be able to have too much success in this fight against Botelho, especially not the level of success she had against Cachoeira where she was allowed to land over 100 strikes. I don't see that happening here. I think the fight is going to be predominantly played out on the feet. I think that Botelho has good kicks, she's got a good kicking game, kicks to the body, to the legs, and I think her punches are going to be there as well. Even if Botelho is struggling on the feet, which I don't think will be the case, Botelho has shown that she's got a wrestling game as well. Again, that wrestling game isn't going to be strong enough to compete at the top of the division, but at this level, I wouldn't be surprised if she would be able to take Carolina down and control her on the mat as well. So I think Botelho's got multiple paths to victory, but ultimately where I believe that this fight is played out predominantly is where Botelho is better. So for those reasons, I'm picking Poliana Botelho to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Randa Markos versus Luana Pinheiro. Pinheiro is currently the minus 170 favourite to come back on Markos at plus 150 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I honestly think this is another one of those cases of a Dana White Contender Series fighter. He's coming into the UFC, fighting someone that's been in the UFC for years with tons of experience, fighting the best competition, and is then a moderately sized favourite. We've seen it time and time again. I do think that it's not going to be an easy fight for Markos, but at plus 150. With the experience she's got against the level of competition that she's been fighting, I do think that she is the value side here. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, Pinheiro was close to a minus 200 favourite just a couple of days ago. Markos money has come in. I do agree with that trend. I do think that that trend will continue. I think Pinheiro will go into the fight on Saturday night roughly around a minus 150 favourite, with Markos sitting at around plus 125, plus 130. As for how the fight plays out though, it's imperative that Markos gets a wrestling game going here. If she stays on the feet and tries to strike with Pinheiro, I don't think it'll be a whitewash, but Pinheiro's a really aggressive, forward-moving striker, boxing heavy, will land hard punches, has the ability to finish on the feet as well. So that's really important for Pinheiro. But Markos, if she stands toe-to-toe with Pinheiro, I just don't see her winning this fight at all. She's got to get back to her wrestling, and she's in desperate need of a win, and she's in desperate need of being able to find the path of least resistance very quickly to be able to give herself a comfortable chance of winning this fight. I think that Markos can get a wrestling game going here. I haven't seen too much of Pinheiro's defensive grappling, but I think if Markos was to get on top and establish a top position, I think she would be able to ride some of that time out of the round on top and just be able to try and swing the fight in her favour. The other thing weirdly that I think sits in the favour of Markos is if she does start to get pieced up on the feet by Pinheiro. If Pinheiro's getting off on her strikes and really starting to hurt Markos, then I think that will force the wrestling and the takedowns more from Markos. And if she does become relentless, even if she's not scoring takedowns every time, even if she's just clinching up, pushing Pinheiro up against the cage and wasting time on the clock that way, she's going to be the one in those scenarios that are winning the moments in that fight when she's pinning Pinheiro up against the cage. Like I said, I don't think it's going to be easy because the effective striking criteria on the judges' scorecards are weighted so heavily now that I do think if Pinheiro does start to be aggressive and starts to hit Markos hard, then she could start putting herself in a dominant position and winning the rounds that way. Markos has to make this fight dirty, ugly, grind away at Pinheiro to get the win. But she can do that. She's done that in previous fights. She can stick to her opponents like glue. And here I am going to actually side with the underdog that has more experience, that has fought the much higher level of competition in mixed martial arts. I'm picking Randa Markos to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Gabriel Benitez versus Jonathan Pearce. Benitez is currently the minus 210 favourite. The comeback on Pearce at plus 175 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I do think the value sits with the favourite in Gabriel Benitez. In my opinion, he should be a bigger favourite. He should be closer to minus 260, minus 270, but sitting at minus 210, I do think there's value there. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I do think we see more money coming in on Benitez, but Jonathan Pearce, there is some love for him out there. You know, Benitez did go down to minus 190, minus 185 because of that money coming in on Pearce, so there clearly is people out there betting Pearce. And I do actually think that that'll prevent the betting lines from getting up to minus 250, minus 260, minus 270. So come fight night on Saturday night, with some fluctuation, I do expect the betting lines to be sitting roughly where they're at right about now. But as for how this fight plays out, I think there's levels to this game, and I think Benitez is levels above where Jonathan Pearce is at. And I mean this not only from a skill set perspective, but an experience perspective as well. Benitez has had so many fights in the UFC, he's had some really tough fights as well, and I think he's beaten fighters that are better than Jonathan Pearce, and I think that's an important note to make here. Listen, I'll say this, Jonathan Pearce is an exciting fighter. I actually like him a lot. He's aggressive, he likes to move forward, he likes to hit hard, really put his opponents on the back foot and pressure them really hard as well. But I just don't see him bringing anything to the table here in this fight inside the cage that Benitez hasn't seen or dealt with before. And sure, I think that Pearce will have his moments in this fight. I don't think it's going to be all one-way traffic, but I think that anything he tries in regards to the striking is going to get countered by Benitez. I think once he starts feeling the power of Benitez, especially with the kicks to the legs and to the body, it's going to prevent him from coming forward, and Pearce needs to come forward to be able to win this fight. That's crucial to him, and if he's not able to come forwards, or if he's a little bit hesitant, or if Benitez really does start damaging the legs with his low kicks and that halts the movement of Pearce and he starts struggling that way, I think Benitez will just take over the fight. I think with Benitez, he can fight well going forwards and he can fight well going backwards. He's got hard counters, and I think that's going to be key in this fight. It's always a key thing when a fighter can fight as well moving backwards as they can moving forwards. I can't say the same for Pearce. I actually think the path to victory for Pearce here is to try and relentlessly wrestle wrestle Benitez similar to what he did against Kai Kamaka in his last fight, really try and put that wrestling on Benitez, get him down and try and control him. But because Benitez is a really solid striker with really hard kicks, this type of relentless wrestling game plan is something that a lot of fighters have tried against him in the past and ultimately failed. He's not very easy to take down, and if you can take him down, he's got a really good get-up game to get back up to his feet. But ultimately, if you're not the one pressing the pace and pushing forwards, then you're not going to be able to score those takedowns anyway. And I feel that once Benitez has got the respect of Pearce, he'll be the one controlling the pace of the fight and dictating the range. I just think this is a really good fight for Benitez to really look good in this fight and put a stamp on where he is and where he wants to be. So I think Benitez has got a good stylistic fight ahead of him here. I think he's going to be able to beat Jonathan Pearce in the area where the fight's won and lost, which I believe will be on the feet. For those reasons, I'm picking Gabriel Benitez to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Kamaka III versus TJ Brown. Kamaka's currently the minus 155 favourite. The comeback on Brown at plus 135 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, right now, I would say the value sits slightly with the underdog in TJ Brown at plus 135. But if the line continues to trend in the way it is now, with the money coming in on Brown, I think if the line closes and Kamaka becomes closer to a minus 130, minus 135 favourite, then the value would probably flip over to Kamaka's side. I just think that the line is just slightly too wide at the minute and slightly too wide enough to make that value side sit with the underdog in Brown. As for where the betting line moves though, as I've just said, the current trend is the money coming in on Brown. I do expect this to continue. I do think the line does close up a little bit, and I do expect Kamaka to go into the cage on Saturday night at around that minus 130, minus 135 range, with TJ Brown sitting at around plus 120, plus 125. As for how this fight plays out though, it's a really good fight because both fighters stylistically have got very similar styles. Kamaka's got good boxing and wrestling, TJ Brown has got good kickboxing and wrestling. The slight difference is I think Kamaka is more boxing over wrestling, whereas TJ Brown is more wrestling over kickboxing. But ultimately, when both fighters mix it up in the cage, they can both mix it up really well, and they both portray themselves to be good strikers and good wrestlers as well. Both have got the holes though, and this is what makes the fight interesting. Kamaka's holes I think were exposed in his last fight against Jonathan Pearce. I didn't expect Pearce to put on that type of wrestling performance, taking him down, and not just taking him down, but taking him down relatively easily. And also when Kamaka's taken down, he does like to show his back. A lot of fighters do this though to help them stand back up. The problem comes is when you have a fighter that likes to back take quickly, which Pearce did. It really exposed Kamaka in that way in his last fight. Whereas the holes for TJ Brown, I think that there's question marks on his durability. He loves to stick his head into guillotines. I think his fight IQ comes into question a little bit, and I also think his cardio can let him down as well. He does look like he's sucking for air sort of after 5 to 7 minutes every fight. So for as good as both of these fighters are offensively, I think they've both got holes in the game and stuff that they need to work on. The bottom line here though is one of these fighters has to win, and when you get two fighters like in this fight that have got very similar styles, you have to look at where the biggest advantages are in the fight. I think the biggest advantage in this fight is aimed towards Kamaka, and it's within the striking, his boxing, his speed, the tool set, and the fact that he rips to the head, the body, and he has power with that speed as well. Really calm and composed inside of the exchanges, fiery exchanges. I think that Kamaka is going to be able to look great there on the night. I think for TJ Brown, he's got to get his wrestling game going, and to get his wrestling game going, he's got to get close to Kamaka in order to shoot those takedowns, unless he decides to shoot from too far out, and in that case, I don't think he'll score the takedowns. But when he gets close to Kamaka, I think Kamaka's going to be able to let rip with combinations, those combinations, like I've already said, that go to the body and to the head. And I think that's where the biggest difference is in this fight. Kamaka can wrestle as well. The other thing, if TJ Brown does take Kamaka down and he does show his back, then Brown to me doesn't look like your typical back take hunter. He won't hunt for the back and try to jump on it at every opportunity. That's what Jonathan Pearce did in his last fight against Kamaka, to the point where he was trying to hop his back whilst he was standing. That's not the type of game that TJ Brown plays. So I think if Kamaka does show his back if he's taken down, I think he will be able to work back up to his feet, because I don't think that Brown is going to hunt for that back. And then the fight gets back to the feet, they start striking again. I think the cardio of Kamaka, the output and volume over 3 rounds, is greater than Brown as well. I think if he starts hurting Brown and pushing him backwards, I think he could push him backwards with hitting him hard, with getting respect. I don't think that Brown's going to be able to shoot those takedowns easily moving backwards, and I think Kamaka will start to look better and start to grow into the fight more and more the longer the fight goes on. He's definitely going to have to work on his wrestling defense, because if he does start piecing setting TJ Brown up like I think he's going to on the feet, that's only going to want to make TJ Brown take Kamaka down even more. He's going to force the wrestling, force the takedown, so Kamaka's got to have his defensive wrestling on point. But I think the bigger moments in this fight are going to be the moments that are landed with the quick, hard combinations that Kai Kamaka will be landing. And it's for that reason that I'm picking Kai Kamaka III to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Sam Hughes versus Loma Lookboonmee. Lookboonmee is currently the minus 370 favourite. The comeback on Hughes at plus 310 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I understand why the line's so wide, and it is wide. But with that being said, I still think that Loma Lookboonmee is a better bet, potentially even in a parlay at minus 370 than Sam Hughes is at plus 310. I think it's a really difficult fight, this one, for Sam Hughes. And as for where the betting lines move throughout fight week at other books, Loma Lookboonmee has reached minus 400. I think that trend continues. I do think she's going to be in plenty of parlays. I think people will be playing her straight as well. It is a good stylistic fight for her from a skill set perspective as well. And I expect her to close at around minus 450 come fight night on Saturday night. As for how this fight plays out though, I think it's going to be won and lost on the feet predominantly. Sam Hughes has got a decent all-round game. She will mix things up really well inside the cage, between her striking to her takedown attempts. I don't think she's a BJJ wizard though, and I also don't think she's a beast wrestler. So although she might get close on a couple of takedowns, she might even take Loma Lookboonmee down. I never like to say a fighter can't take an opponent down, because it only takes one good shot or one mistake from the opponent, a misplaced foot, or they're off balance, or they're starting to fall, or anything like that. So Sam Hughes could potentially get a takedown, but I just don't think it's going to be enough for her to win this fight. I don't think she's going to be able to do it often enough to win this fight. I think that Lookboonmee, if she is taken down, she'll get right back up to her feet. And on the feet, it's just a complete mismatch. Loma Lookboonmee is a talented striker, Muay Thai background, plenty of Muay Thai fights as well. She's vicious on the feet, good combination. She mixes things up really well between her kicks, between her hands, between her elbows and knees. She's just going to be a lot for Sam Hughes to deal with, and I don't think Sam Hughes will have ever fought a striker with the caliber of experience that Loma Lookboonmee's got. I think it's a good fight for Loma Lookboonmee to look great inside the cage, get another win on her record, and push forward and start the drive to the top of the division. I do think that Lookboonmee has got the potential to go far in this game. I think it's a difficult fight for Hughes. I expect Hughes to get out volumed. I expect Loma Lookboonmee to land the more impactful strikes, the more combinations. I expect her to be the aggressor and the one pushing forwards through the majority of the fight. So yeah, I'd be really surprised if Sam Hughes did anything that impacted the fight that much, that enabled her to get the win here. So for those reasons, I'm picking Loma Lookboonmee to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got KB Bhullar versus Andreas Michailidis. Michailidis is currently the minus 250 favourite. The comeback on Bhullar at plus 210 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I do think there's an argument that Michailidis might be a little bit too wide in this spot, but at the same time, I kind of get it as well. And if you are pushing me for which side here is the better bet on the money line, I do think that Michailidis at minus 250 is a better bet than Bhullar at plus 210. Now, as for where this betting line moves throughout fight week, I don't think it's going to move all too much, to be honest. And I think it's going to be one of those cases where there's not a lot of people rushing to the betting window to lay the minus 250 on Michailidis, but at the same time, people don't really want to play the underdog in Bhullar at plus 210 either. So it's in those sort of fights where there might be a little bit of movement for and against both fighters, but ultimately, come fight night on Saturday night, I think both fighters' betting lines are going to be sitting roughly where they're at right about now. But as for how this fight plays out, it's interesting that Michailidis is coming down from light heavyweight to middleweight here. He isn't or wasn't the biggest light heavyweight, and he's not the biggest middleweight either, but even though he's only 6'4", he is quite stacked, he is quite stocky, he does have power, he can be aggressive, he can mix in takedowns as well, so his physicality definitely makes up for the lack of height, shall we say. Whereas Bhullar, I think he's the opposite. He's a very tall middleweight at 6'4", but he doesn't have that stocky frame that's going to allow him to be really physical with a lot of fighters in this division, and I think a lot of fighters will be able to bully him inside the cage. I definitely think Michailidis is going to be one of those fighters, because although Michailidis is giving up 4 inches in height, I think he's going to be able to get in on the hips of Bhullar. I think he's going to be able to try and take him down. If he can't take him down, I think he'll he'll be able to get around the hips of Bula and just pin him up against the cage and just make this a dirty, ugly, physical fight. And that's the type of fight where I don't think Bula will be that competitive in. I think Michailidis will be able to be bullying him on the night. So for me, with Bula being the taller, longer, rangier fighter, I think he's got to try and stick on the outside and just ultimately keep Michailidis on the end of all his punches and his kicks. But this is back to being the small cage. There's not going to be a lot of room, and Michailidis is a little tank himself. He will be aggressive, he'll be moving forwards. I don't think the strikes of Bula will be that powerful enough to deter Michailidis from taking one or two to be able to close that distance either. And the way that Tom Breeze ran through Bula is very alarming. And I'm not discrediting Tom Breeze there, but being dropped the way he was dropped and completely smoked in the way he was smoked, it just makes me question the level that Bula's at. Is he a UFC caliber fighter? I'm not convinced. I don't think that Michailidis is going to run through a lot of guys in the division either, but Michailidis, at least he's game, at least he's got power. He will keep up activity and volume, and he'll mix things up with his striking and wrestling. I just think that Michailidis is the better fighter wherever this fight goes. Stylistically, as long as Michailidis doesn't stay on the outside and get picked apart and outpointed for 3 rounds, then I think he's going to be fine. But Michailidis loves to be a hothead, he loves to come forward and be aggressive, so it's just not his style to stick on the outside, and for me that's the only way Bula wins this fight. I think Michailidis has got a good fight in front of him. I'm picking Andreas Michailidis to win this fight. And in the final breakdown of this episode, we've got Luke Sanders versus Felipe Colares. Sanders is currently the -155 favourite. The comeback on Colares at +135 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, the value for me has to be with Felipe Colares. And I don't mean to be disrespectful, but any fighter with a plus next to their money line against Luke Sanders has instantly got my attention. I just simply do not trust Luke Sanders, and I said it half as a joke on the episode of the podcast of his last fight, that he will find a way to lose fights. And that's exactly what happened in his last fight. He found a way to lose. So I think from a value perspective, the value has to be on the plus money of Felipe Colares. Now, as for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I do anticipate this line closing up. I think that when both fighters step into the cage on Saturday night, it is going to be a dead even pick'em. But if Colares was a slight favourite, that wouldn't surprise me either. Now, as for how this fight plays out, it's a real shame that I'm talking in this way about Luke Sanders, because I actually think that he's a fighter with really good skills. I think he's a good striker. I think he puts combinations together really well. I think he has power in his strikes as well. I think his cardio checks out. I think he's got decent wrestling. He's got decent grappling. But the problem is, like I've already mentioned at the start of this breakdown, he just finds a way to lose fights in the sketchiest ways, and it makes him completely untrustable. And you go through his record and we'll look at the fights that have been sketchy. So the Uri Alcantara fight, he was smashing Alcantara, and then in the second round he was smashing Alcantara, but then he fell into a knee bar, tapped very quickly to that knee bar. Then in the next fight, Andre Sukumtar, he won that first round comfortably against Sukumtar, came out in the second round reckless, left his chin open, gets knocked out. And then in the fight after that, he fights Patrick Williams. Now, albeit he did beat Patrick Williams, but Sanders closed a -500 favourite. So that just tells you the difference between those two fighters, and Sanders honestly made that fight much closer than it should have been, and it did look at times that he was going to find a way to lose that fight there as well. Then the fight after that, this is probably the one fight that I'm not going to actually knock him for, against Hani Yahya. So Hani Yahya heel hooked him in the first round. Again, how it happened wasn't great, and Sanders did have a big advantage on the feet, but Yahya is a really good fighter and he'll tap out a lot of people, so that's probably the only one that I'm not really going to slam him for. Then Renan Barao afterwards, yes, he won the fight, but again, he nearly threw away the fight in round 1 and he had to come back in round 2, so a little bit of a different scenario. But this wasn't prime Renan Barao, this was the ghost of Renan Barao, the ghost of Renan Barao that everybody was smoking, yet Luke Sanders still had problems in round 1, and fair play to him, he did come in round 2 and do what he needed to do. And then against Nate Maness, like I said, when I broke that fight down in that podcast episode, I did say that Sanders has every advantage from a skill set over Nate Maness, but something tells me that he's going to find a way to lose that fight, and that's exactly what happened. He came in round 1, he smoked Nate Maness, he was looking great, and then round 2 started and he found himself choked out by the end of the fight, and it's just really frustrating to watch because Sanders, from a skill set perspective, is a very good fighter. And I'm going to say the same thing here. I think that he doesn't have as much of an advantage with the skill set against Colares as he did in his last fight against Nate Maness, which for a start is a worry. But I do think from a striking perspective, Colares is a decent striker. He's not terrible, he's not amazing either, but he can hang in there, and he's got okay wrestling, and his grappling's good as well, but he's got a tool set that is ready and waiting for Luke Sanders to slip up and make a mistake, and I think that's what happens. I think Sanders will come into this fight. I think he'll look great in round 1, and if he doesn't finish this fight in round 1, I think something's going to happen in round 2 that allows Kolares to take advantage of a mistake, probably with a takedown or a submission attempt, and he'll get Luke Sanders out of there. And I don't think Luke Sanders will stop Kolares in round 1. Just look at the shots that Montel Jackson landed on Kolares, clean, hard shots that didn't knock him out. I've got no idea what kept Kolares conscious in that fight, but the durability is definitely one of his best traits. Not that it's a trait you should really be proud of, getting hit like that, but I just don't think Sanders getting Kolares out of there is a high percentage probability. I don't think it's very likely to happen, although it could. I think Kolares is going to get beaten in round 1. I think he's going to come out in round 2. I think he's going to be able to implement his game, maybe score a takedown, maybe get the back of Luke Sanders, or just start grappling on him, establishing a good top position. I think he's going to be able to get him out of there, even without a mistake from Luke Sanders, even without Luke Sanders throwing the fight away. I think Kolares has got a really good chance of winning this fight, but you add that extra element in of Luke Sanders just finding ways to lose fights, and I do think it's going to be enough to be a problem for him in this fight. For that reason, I'm picking Felipe Kolares to win this fight. And that's all for this episode of On the Money Line. I hope you all enjoyed it, and as always, fight fans, I'd appreciate all the likes to the video and subscriptions to our MMA Play 365 YouTube channel too. Remember, you can get all the betting advice you'll ever need over at MMAplay365.com. We cater for long-term gamblers that like to build their own bets and strategies, gamblers that just want to follow exactly what I bet on, and we also cater for you fun gamblers that like the long shot fun parlays, or ACCAs, accumulators as we call them in the UK. Even if you only want our best value underdog for the event, which comes with a money back guarantee by the way, we have plenty of different packages and subscription options for you guys to choose from, which also now includes our DFS packages for DraftKings and FanDuel. It is worth just mentioning that all of our subscriptions are at very affordable prices too. Just hop onto MMAplay365.com and see what's best for you. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you at the next event.